Welcome back to World Religions, a video series to accompany a semester-long Survey of World Religions course, specifically intended to accompany the textbook A Short Introduction to World Religions, edited by Christopher Partridge. Chapter 8, Indigenous Religions in Asia. This chapter is going to be a brief summary of indigenous religions in Asia. When attempting to briefly summarize the great variety and diversity of indigenous religions for the purpose of a course like this, it's really easy to fall into the trap of just trying to stay at generalities and talking about, well, the religions tend to have these features in common. They tend to believe in this, that, and the other thing. But the reality is, despite the common patterns, there's a lot of individual diversity. So there isn't enough time to go into detail about all or even most of the dozens or hundreds of indigenous religions in Asia. Rather, we're just going to take a couple of representative examples, such as the religion of the Kondh people of Odisha, India. There are some general themes, though, that we'll cover at first. So it's very common in indigenous religions generally, including those of Asia, to focus on the nature of religious practice, how to perform a ritual, what rituals to perform and when, rather than trying to articulate verbally doctrines about the gods, the spirits, or even like a metaphysical interpretation of rituals and why they work and so on. Religious concepts are commonly expressed through the rituals themselves, and those concepts and actions don't always result from verbal beliefs like explicit theologies or metaphysics. You tend to see the latter more commonly in missionary religions like Christianity, Islam, or Buddhism. So harmony and relationship is important for a lot of indigenous religions. The main relationships are those with gods and spirits, other human beings, and nature itself. So the goal often of ceremony is to try to restore the original cosmic balance of forces that humans basically depend upon to survive and thrive. The author of this chapter, Barbara Bowl, is a well-known, highly regarded scholar of Asian indigenous religions. She says on page 47 of the book, quote, "Each group has religious practices appropriate to themselves and their environment," end quote. Now, I want to point out this quotation because I think it shows both the strengths and the weaknesses or limitations of a lot of contemporary Western scholarship of other cultures, religions. So she seems to assume that every religion of indigenous peoples anyway is perfectly functional and adaptive and appropriate to the people in their situation. I don't think we need to make that assumption. That's a very strong assumption. It assumes there's never an exception. I think it's inspired by this sort of idealistic strand of contemporary Western scholarship and culture that often assumes, well, if it's indigenous, if it's traditional, it's good, it's functional, it's adaptive. It's only modernity or Western culture or something like that that creates unbalance, that creates a lack of fit between culture and environment. So it's possible that this is a true claim, but obviously very controversial, difficult to prove. There seems to be a lot of evidence against it. You could probably come up with some examples. And so fortunately, we don't need to make such a strong assumption in order to have a helpful perspective to study indigenous religions. Rather, we can be more neutral and just say to ourselves, let's look for aspects of the religion that are functional. Let's be open to the possibility that even if something seems superstitious or exotic or strange or hard to fathom or irrational, it may actually serve a function in that culture. It may actually help the people adapt and respond to their environment. So it's more openness to that possibility that I think is important in having the right mindset to study these religions objectively, rather than asserting it as an absolute dogma that all of these cultures are perfectly adapted, perfectly fit. And it's kind of interesting because you can see the pendulum swing the history of Western scholarship of indigenous religions. If you go back far enough, say more than 50 to 100 or more years ago, a lot of the scholarship was very prejudicial in the sense that there was often an assumption, well, these cultures are primitive, they're less developed, their religion is irrational in ways that modern or missionary religions aren't, or cultures aren't. And that's a prejudice in the opposite direction. But the pendulum swung somewhere after the Second World War, probably around the same time as the counterculture picked up in the 1960s and 70s, where scholars took a more optimistic or even idealistic view towards indigenous cultures, where it became they can do no wrong or they're perfectly adapted. As you can probably see if you reflect on it, both of these appear to be exaggerated or extreme positions, and even if one of them happened to be true, it's the sort of thing that you shouldn't assume as part of your methodology, but rather perhaps conclude after a long period of study. Meanwhile, a better methodology is to just try to be neutral, try to take an objective stance, both be able to recognize cases where religious beliefs or behaviors may be functional, and also, or adaptive, and also be willing and open to recognize cases where religious beliefs and behaviors may be superstitious or may embody a false understanding of the way natural causation works. If we have both of those perspectives in mind, we're probably going to be a lot more objective. Shamanism is very important in Asian indigenous religions, just like other indigenous religions. The term shaman comes from a Siberian culture. It's the Russian way of pronouncing essentially this word, from the Siberian culture. And the term has since been used by scholars to refer to ritual experts in mainly indigenous religions, sometimes in other types of religions too. So most shamans are male, but there are female shamans as well in some cultures, such as among the Tuvans. In the picture is a Tuvan shaman having a fire seance. So this is where they can make contact with spirits and communicate with them. The word seance usually implies either communication with a spirit. It can also imply spirit possession, where the spirit actually takes hold of the person's body and speaks through them to communicate their information. So Siberian religion is animist. They believe in many gods of nature or spirits of nature, but they also usually believe in a high god who is regarded as transcendent and beyond normal human affairs. It could be phrased as beyond good and evil. It's interesting because the high gods that are often recognized by indigenous religions, even though they're often creator gods or else they're regarded as the top of a hierarchy of gods and spirits, they're usually not the focus of the religion, precisely because they're so distant from everyday human affairs and from the small workings of nature. Rather, the spirits that are more often interacted with are those that are local or of a particular place, of a particular family, and so on. In a seance, a shaman will often enter a trance state. This can be described as an ecstatic trance, where ecstasy implies some kind of transcendence of the self, alteration of the usual sense of self. This can be interpreted as the shaman's soul leaving their body to communicate with spirits. They typically would bring back instructions to restore the situation, so cure the illness, remove the curse or misfortune, and so on. You can see similar practices in other religions that aren't always classified as indigenous. For example, the Ainu people of northern Japan have similar practices, even if they're also Buddhist. Indigenous Taiwanese cultures and Hakka Chinese, they practice Taoism, but some communities of Hakka Chinese, both in southern China, but usually actually in Southeast Asia, like in their communities in Singapore or Malaysia, Indonesia, they will have spirit mediums, people who essentially have been chosen by the gods to be possessed by a particular god or goddess during a ceremony at temple. The ceremony usually involves music and chanting and dancing, and the god enters the person. They usually are garbed in the gear, the clothing, and the accoutrements of the god or goddess, and then they will give prophecies, essentially, or answer people's problems. So there's basically a continuity of these shamanistic practices in some non-indigenous Asian religions too. This is a map of the prevailing world religions by national subdivision, focusing on Asia. And what is being displayed based on the intensity of the color, or the darkness of the shade really, is the percentage of the population that adheres to whatever the prevailing religion is in that national subdivision. So purple is Orthodox Christianity, red is Catholic Christianity, blue is Protestant Christianity, green is the various forms of Islam, orange and orangish brown is Hinduism, yellow and yellow ochre is Buddhism, pink are the indigenous, you could say, religions of East Asia, Japan and China respectively. That includes a mix of Mahayana Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, and so on. And gray means no religion is most common. There is a color for indigenous religions, but it's hard to spot. It is the less yellow, the less orange, light brown, and mid brown. And you can see parts of southwest China, so just to the left of the pink area, and parts of Southeast Asia that have this non-yellowish, non-orangish brown color. And a lot of the areas where indigenous religions are practiced, they're not even going to show up on this map because the prevailing religion could be another religion. The majority of the population, even at the national subdivision level, is either Muslim or Catholic or Buddhist or Hindu, for instance. So it's kind of hard to use these maps of prevailing religions to show where the indigenous religions are practiced. But they are still practiced in little pockets throughout much of Asia, including in parts of India, Southeast Asia, the East Indies or Indonesia, the Philippines, China, and so on. Many of the people who still practice indigenous religions in Asia are nomadic. And these are people that are unrelated based on their language and their ancestry. So they're different ethnic groups with their own languages, their own cultures, their own religion. So there's a huge diversity of types of religion there. Some examples of the various peoples who still practice indigenous religion are listed on the slide. So for example, in India, there's some tribes in West Central and South India, such as in Odisha and in Chotanagpur. There's also the Andaman Islands off the coast of India that are part of the nation that has an indigenous community there. Cambodia and Southeast Asia, there's various peoples of the forest and the coastal wetlands, such as, just to name an example, the Khmer Liu. And in Indonesia, hunter-gatherers of central parts of the island of Kalimantan, Celebes, and eastern Sumatra. So it's often the mountainous, jungly, or hilly areas that are less suitable for farming. Those are the areas that still have these traditional ways of life that are hunter-forager or otherwise nomadic, where the traditional cultures and religions are preserved. In Malaysia, the Samang, Negritos, and the Senoi, such as the Ma Mary, in the jungle hills of Malaysia and Philippines. There's groups as well as in Siberia. Now, Siberia, it's not necessarily hills covered with jungle or forest. It's a variety of terrains that are just more isolated, more remote, in more northerly altitudes that are less suitable for farming. Peoples related to the Mongolians, like the Tuvans or the Buryats, the Manchus. You have other people further to the north, such as the Nenets, etc. So on the slide are just a very small number of the literally hundreds of different ethnic groups that have their own indigenous traditions. The way of life of these people obviously varies, but because many live in forested hills, they will have some things in common. They typically live in small roaming bands that have a fixed territory, you might say, but they roam around within their group's territory. And the size of the group does vary. It could just be one extended family led by an elder, or it could be several families together in what you would call a small village or a large band. The foods that they eat are various, but they include roots, tubers, leaves, fruits, so things that are foraged, and various types of hunted and fished animals, such as speared or trapped fish, small game hunted by bow and arrow, or in Malaysia by blowgun and poison dart. And they often have norms that enforce equal sharing of food, although that does vary from culture to culture. So one of the examples of an indigenous people that we're going to look at from Asia is the Senoi from Malaysia. They're a hill people who live in those jungled hills or mountains. They do practice a type of farming called slash and burn cultivation. So they'll slash down part of the forest, plant their crops, return later in the year, but they won't keep that area permanently under cultivation. They will move around and slash a new part of the forest in subsequent years. And partly that's to prevent the soil from being overly depleted of nutrients. The Senoi are actually semi-sedentary. It means they don't move around all the time. They do spend part of the year around the crops that they have planted in their plots that they've slashed and burned. But then after the harvesting season, they will migrate around in their territory. So they have these base camps they live in during the cultivation season, and then as they're going around to hunt and gather in other areas, they live in temporary shelters that they build along the way. And they base their living and cultivating and harvesting. In other words, their decisions of where to slash and burn, where to forage, based on their communication with the spirits. Senoi rituals often involve beliefs about taboos. These are things that are either ritually impure or things that you have to avoid in order to avoid offending gods or other sacred beings. And they often involve work restriction in the sense of when, where, by whom the work should be done. During the cultivation season, there are rituals performed by the whole community to seek the spirit's help to ensure a good crop. And they even have these periods of spiritual quarantine where people restrict their usual activities in order to avoid offending the spirits, in order to basically follow the proper protocol. Sickness is when the person's soul has wandered outside of the group. So there's a spiritual but also a social dimension to the Senoi interpretation of illness. And so a shaman can be used to help bring the person's soul back. They will use herbs and plants that the spirits don't like to drive away evil spirits that are harming the person and making them sick. And as I mentioned in previous videos, the indigenous religions often don't have a sense that some spirits are innately or always evil, like demons. Rather, the evil spirits are often the ones you've offended somehow. So it's like disrespecting a spirit that could help you in another circumstance. If you knowingly or unknowingly disrespect them, then they may cause the illness, and so that's when you have to bring the shaman in to restore their relationship or just drive them out altogether. The concept of taboo has been very important for the Western scholarship of religion. The word comes from a Polynesian language, but it's used in the scholarship to mean something like a ritual prohibition, a behavior that shouldn't be performed because it offends the spirits or otherwise upsets spiritual energy, power, can lead to curses and things of that nature. The textbook has a couple of quotations from Western scholars about taboo that are informative. This from Gerardus van der Leeuw. Quote, "Taboo is a sort of warning, danger, high voltage. Power has been stored up and we must be on our guard. The taboo is the expressly authenticated condition of being replete with power, and man's reaction to it should rest on a clear recognition of this potent fullness, should maintain the proper distance and secure protection." End quote. So you can see from that quotation that taboo is also connected to the notion of spiritual power. So it is prohibitions around sources or centers of powers that can be dangerous if not treated with the proper caution, with the proper respect. Here's a quote from Mircea Eliade. Quote, "The elements of the taboo are always the same. Certain things or persons or places belong in some way to a different order of being, and therefore contact with them will produce an upheaval at the ontological level, which might well prove fatal, end quote. Ontological is a philosophical term meaning theory of being or existence. So it's talking about things that are on a different level of being or existence, essentially. So you see here the notion of danger, of upheaval, of even death, fatality, if the taboos are not respected, if spirits or these other powers are offended. So the Senoi people have many taboos, and these are often invoked around periods of trouble or distress, like illness or death. So if someone is seriously ill, the whole group will respect certain taboos and rituals, such as spending days and nights in music and in dances where the community is possessed by spirits that can help relieve the illness. And there's also a practice of sacrifice, ritual sacrifice among the Senoi that gives an offering to drive a spirit out from the sick person. Death is in some ways even more serious. So if a person dies, there's a whole other set of rituals that begin. Deaths are regarded as dangerous like births. These are periods of pushing up against the boundaries of life. And beyond the boundaries of human life is often thought to be the other world, the spirit world. And so there's a lot of different gods and spirits there that can be powerful, that can be helpful, that can be dangerous. But the danger of the breaking of the boundary is what is most salient in a lot of these death taboos. So the group will isolate itself, both for their safety and that of their neighbors, until the time of danger, the time of pollution is over, and they can resume their normal livelihood. There's a belief among the Senoi that if anyone in the community breaks a taboo, that will result in terrifying tropical storms sent by the spirits. Senoi believe in many different spirits. There's a storm god who's regarded as supreme, but even though the storm god is in a way the ruler of the hierarchy, as with many indigenous religions, that's not the god that's the main focus of their worship. Rather, more local nature spirits and ancestor spirits are important. The Senoi, this is not always the case with indigenous religions, but among the Senoi, there isn't a real strong sense of hierarchy among the other spirits themselves. So we have the non-human spirits that are basically like nature gods, and then the ancestors are the spirits of the departed that are related by their lineage to the living members of the community. And there's the belief that the safety of the community depends on their unity and their harmony. Now, on the one hand, ancestor spirits don't generally participate in that. So if the ancestors are manifesting in an overt way, usually that's a sign that something is wrong, something is off. It is time to call in the shaman to help deal with that. In this and the previous slide, there were pictures of graves, and the significance there is just to note that gifts are given with the departed when they're placed into the earth, and these gifts are believed to help them in the afterlife. Now, moving on to a totally unrelated other indigenous people of Asia, the Kondhs of India. So they're an example of a tribe with a more complex social structure. So they may be sedentary, they could be farmers, they may live in larger settlements, they have a more developed economy, relatively speaking. There's also a trend, not always universally the case, but oftentimes with these more complex social structures, you also get a stronger pattern of rituals and or ritual specialists. So it's kind of a spectrum. In other words, like how many rituals there are, exactly how formalized they are, how many types of ritual specialists there are, and so on. And it's still the case, though, with the Kondhs that rituals for an individual, like to heal them of an illness, will involve the whole community. Now, Kondh is actually a name given by outsiders to their group. They call themselves the Kwe, and they live in the jungle-covered eastern Ghats of the state of Orissa or Odisha, India. Their population in total is over 1 million, but they live in smaller settlements, not in big cities for the most part. They no longer practice their traditional lifestyle, but formerly they practiced slash and burn farming on their hills during the wet season, and then hunting and gathering during the dry season, where they would be more nomadic, like the Senoi. So they have a belief in many different gods. The two main gods of the Kondh, though, are Bura and Tari. Bura is the creator god, Tari is the earth goddess. And below them are various grades of spirits, high ranking, low ranking, and more localized. The high ranking spirits include gods of the hill, of disease, smallpox, of boundaries between different groups, of iron and war, or of hunting. The lower ranking spirits often preside over particular springs, trees, or lesser hills, and then there's sacred groves with each village that are sacred to the local hill god or guardian spirit associated with that village. So one of the most important stories or myths of the Kondh is of their creator gods, Bura and Tari. So Bura created Tari, the goddess, as his companion, but she then tried to prevent his creating the world and humanity. The world was originally meant to be a paradise, but Tari's growing jealousy of Bura led to fierce conflict between the two. And there was this war, this struggle, and most of the Khans believe that Tari won, but she let Bura survive and remain as her kind of lieutenant, her second in command. And it was Tari eventually who would teach humans hunting, war, and farming. But she demanded a price in human blood, a human sacrifice, which she would devour as her food before she would give that fertility, that fruits and other foods of the land to humans. Now, according to the myth of the Kondh, the humans, their ancestors, the Kondhs, originally resisted the goddess's demands, but when they did so, they found themselves plagued with drought, with famine, with pestilence, disease, and death. And so they started the custom of human sacrifice to appease the goddess to ensure the fertility of their land. So Kondh human sacrifice is no longer practiced, but it was called Mariah. Now, the British first encountered this practice in 1835 when they were ruling over British East India. It was actually this private corporation, the British East India Company, that originally had sovereignty over India. Later, the British government took over directly in a regime called the British Raj. But regardless, the British were horrified by the practice and tried to put it to a stop and basically succeeded. The human sacrifice was replaced by a buffalo sacrifice. Now, the Khans traditionally believed that they needed to constantly sacrifice humans every year to ensure that the earth would continue to be fruitful so they could continue to survive. They thought that the goddess Tari would only grant them crops and animals and children if they kept up this tradition of human sacrifice. In the picture is a old wooden Mariah post that was used to tie the victim. Now, in later generations, after the Mariah was outlawed, the buffalo sacrifice came to replace it. Now, even this is starting to decline in a lot of areas. I don't know exactly why, but I would guess it's because the majority religion of India, Hinduism, ironically, in ancient versions of Hinduism, they did practice animal sacrifice, but that has not been the case among many or most Hindus for thousands of years. And there's a very strong taboo against animal sacrifice in Hinduism. So the Khans are in the midst of that broader culture. It may have put pressure on them or influenced their decision to start to back off from the buffalo sacrifice too. But when it's performed, strips of flesh are taken from the buffalo's back and buried in the village. They're put in the land to help make it fruitful. It's also the case that in previous decades and centuries, inter-village warfare was very common among the Khans themselves. So one group or band of Khans would fight another group. However, during the few days involving the performance of the ritual sacrifice, the villages would make temporary peace agreements with each other so the ritual would not be disrupted. And this ritual was actually over a series of 3 or 4 years with each year one stage of the ritual being performed. And it would be celebrated either by everyone in a district, either annually or just during the farming seasons, or when the health of the people or livestock would be affected. So this ritual, and it is still practiced today, helps bind together the Kondhs. It gives them a sense of identity. You know, Tari is their chief goddess, and so it would make sense that they want to continue this ritual, showing that they will sacrifice something valuable to their goddess and ensure their connection to the land. Kondh rituals often involve using mystical powers to restore relationships between people or with them and the spirits, to get communities, villages to heal rifts. Rituals often take place between the high god or goddess, humanity, and the land, and those are the ones centered around the fertility cycle, the farming calendar, the seasonal preparing of the ground, sowing of the seeds, and later reaping of the harvest and threshing. So there's also taboo lifting rituals on hunting and gathering to start off that other part of the annual sequence of getting food from different sources. The other type of ritual is not that associated with fertility or food, but rather with seeking the blessings of ancestors. So this can involve other clans, such as marriages between people from different clans. It can also involve removing an entire village and its ancestors, if need be, to solve a deep problem or pestilence. So sometimes an entire village needs to pick up and leave to solve the spiritual problem. A bit more on the nature of Kondh rituals. So oftentimes the concept of ritual pollution or ritual purity is involved. Ritual pollution is something that causes a spiritual problem through contact. So it operates using a similar method to literal or physical pollution, where there's a source of the pollution, a contaminant, which, if it's contacted, transfers its pollution to the person who contacts it. So there's a similar belief in most religions of ritual pollution and ritual purity. So the pollution doesn't just end by purifying the person who has been contacted by it, or it might end for that person, but the source of the pollution could still be there. And so that's the kind of logic and dynamic through which ritual pollution can work. And usually there's rituals you have to do that purify, that cleanse, that counteract or undo the contamination caused. Now, what sorts of things are regarded as spiritually polluting in Kondh belief? Anything out of the ordinary, especially big changes like both births and deaths. So anything that disrupts the normal pattern of life basically can be thought of as treading upon the spirit world and thus potentially contaminating things with evil spirits, energies, forces, curses, the like. Impurity can also exist at many levels. So minor levels of impurity can usually be solved through just small avoidances by members of a single household. There's been a major violation, even if it was just one person who did it, the whole earth in that area could be polluted. The whole village may have to be involved in a ritual to solve the problem. Deaths that are especially polluting are those that are unexpected, again, out of the ordinary. So death by tiger mauling, death during childbirth, suicide like hanging, or accidental deaths like falling from a tree or drowning, as opposed to the more expected deaths from old age. In the most polluting cases, the entire village is placed under a ritual or spiritual quarantine for a month. So in other words, their day-to-day activities are curtailed and largely disrupted. And the priests and the people undergo daily purification rituals during the quarantine to solve the problem. There's also a separate set of rituals to safeguard life. So in other words, these are not trying to undo contact with the spiritual contaminants, but rather to protect life from various aggressors or misfortunes. So the gods of the hill, if they are offended, disease like smallpox, treading across a boundary dividing one group from another, offense against the gods of war and iron, or of hunting. There's also curses that are caused not just by offending the gods, but that can be caused by humans. Many cultures throughout the old world, Africa and Eurasia, have a belief in the evil eye, which essentially is the ability of some people, such as sorcerers or witches, to curse another person just by looking at them. And so there are other mechanisms through which sorcery or witchcraft are believed to be efficacious or transmitted, but some cultures say just through looking alone, often some kind of noteworthy, intense glance, things like this, they can communicate ill intent, but they're also believed to actually curse people. And so the rituals to safeguard life, that is trying to counteract the damage done from the evil eye, from sorcery, or through some kind of accidental offense. And part of the process is using what are called witch detectives. These are ritual experts who essentially they work like diagnosticians. They diagnose the cause or the source of the problem. They can also be used to return the evil to its originator. And so if there's some sorcerer who gave you the evil eye, you can consult with a witch detective. They'll figure out who did it, and they'll figure out how to counteract it and even enable you to get back at the person who cursed you. So there's several different types of Kondh ritual experts. Seers are the ones who practice divination. They communicate with spirits to learn information, and generally through entering a spiritual trance or some other divination technique. They're the ones who are going to be the diagnosticians of spiritual problems. By analogy, if you go to a doctor, they may diagnose your illness, and then they might refer you to a pharmacist or a surgeon to treat or deal with the illness. So the seer is going to be the diagnostician, ritual expert. The priest may be more akin to the pharmacist or the surgeon. The priest will perform rituals including sacrifice of animals to help appease the spirits. There's also a keeper of the village's shrine stones, so they're the guardian of their local community, whereas a seer or a priest could serve multiple communities. The keeper of the village's shrine stones are chosen by the spirits, and they perform annual purification rituals for that particular village. And the head of every household is responsible for conducting certain rituals to honor their ancestors. And they may also look after household shrines that have bronze emblems of animals, reptiles, or other household spirits. In the slide is an artist depiction from the 19th century of a traditional Kondh Mariah or human sacrifice ritual. The scholar Piers Vitebsky has studied Siberian shamanism extensively, and he has this to say, quote, "Being chosen by the spirits, taught by them to enter a trance and fly with one's soul to other worlds in the sky, or clamber through dangerous crevasses into subterranean worlds, being stripped of one's flesh, reduced to a skeleton, and then reassembled and reborn, gaining the power to combat spiritual enemies and heal their victims, to kill enemies and save one's own people from disease and starvation. These are the features of shamanic religions in many parts of the world," end quote. And I think this is just a nice, short, but vivid illustration of some of the beliefs, practices, and visualizations of shamans in many different indigenous religions. They often involve these extreme states or visions as their soul or spirit is going to the spirit world to get information, to conduct warfare, and so on. The Kondhs tend to view the living, the dead, and the yet to be born as part of one community that extends through time. And they typically envision the afterlife where as being similar to or a continuation in some fashion of the way of life of the living community. So the shades or the ghosts, they will in some form or fashion continue their activities that they did while they were alive in the afterlife. The Kondhs believe that death in old age with a full funeral gives the best hope of a peaceful transition to the world of the ancestors. And if not, there can be various problems. The ancestors can come back. The dead are typically thought to re-enter the home of their family through a spider who will build a home near the funeral pyre. So this represents the idea there's a period of danger of ritual pollution around death, but eventually after that transition is made, after the ancestor is in the world of the ancestors, they've made that step, then they can in a sense be rehabilitated into the home again. They're no longer polluting. Now, a sudden or unexpected death, however, prevents the deceased from being accepted by the ancestors, and that's when those village-wide rituals are often needed to secure their passage into the afterlife. The deceased spirit in that case can become very lonely and potentially dangerous to the living. What's interesting about the Kondh's view of the afterlife is that it's largely determined by the way in which a person dies rather than their good or evil actions when they were alive. So it's not necessarily that if you're a good person, you'll get a good afterlife and vice versa. It's if you die in a troubling, disturbing, unusual, or ritually polluting way, then you may have trouble, and then the people in the community may need to assist you. Thus ends our introductory survey of Asian Indigenous religions. Next up is Chapter 9, Australian Aboriginal Religions. Until next time.